Today's video, we're going to talk about how you can actually break through the current ceiling that you're at. And we're going to be using a principle that one of my clients shared with me. And he runs 8-figure sales teams. And he put it like this. He said 20% of the growth was tactics, right? And 80% was culture and energy and identity, right? Now, the way I look at it is culture is the communal word for identity, right? If identity is individual, culture is communal. So we're going to be talking about the individual version of that, which is identity. And the thing that's important to note here is this isn't new. People are very aware that identity creates their strategy, that who they believe they are kind of dictates the results they're going to get. That's not new. But what's different is we're not going to be talking about mindset, because in my opinion, mindset, if you imagine this as your identity, mindset is like this. It's like a very small part. It's just the top part. And the reality is if you change here, it doesn't change much. This is why often affirmations, or just like people who are super into manifestation mindset work, often if they're operating at this level, don't get very far, because they're just not making a big enough impact on their actual underlying assumptions and underlying truths that they don't change how they genuinely operate day to day. They kind of put a bandage on it instead of change what's truly being created for them internally. Okay. So what I mean by that is, let's say you start telling yourself that I'm deserving and worthy of 50K months, right? That's your mindset work. And you kind of get that, you feel that when in the morning when you do your meditation, it's starting to get to the point where it's feeling pretty good. Yet when you're operating, you're still operating from your unconscious assumptions. And when you get to a point where you might actually get to 50K per month, you're going to come back to these unconscious assumptions, right? The unconscious map, because this is where we live, right? If you can imagine, like you get into a peak state, you get into a high state, you might be operating from here for a moment, but where do you live? Because where you live dictates the results that you're going to have, right? You can be in a peak state, a high state for 10 minutes, for 20 minutes, for an hour, even for one day, but where you live dictates the results, right? Where you are 24 hours of every single day. And so that's when it comes to the internal map. And this is what we actually want to change, because the internal map is how we're actually internalizing everything that's around us, okay? Not positive mindset, but simply, there's so much information out here. How am I actually inferring and internalizing in my world? What are the stories that I'm living in, okay? And so, for example, someone who's at 50K per month, and that's just very normal for them, if they drop to 40, it's not going to be a big deal, because their set point is, I'm just at 50. Yeah, it'll pop back up to 50. No worries, not a problem. Okay. But someone whose identity set point is, let's say, at 20, them going towards 50 but dropping down to 40, 30 is going to feel very, like they're going to create a lot of anxiety, right? They're going to create a lot of stress. They're not going to feel calm. They might be in a sales call with someone who might break them through to that 50K per month. But if their identity set point is at 20, they're probably going to feel really nervous, right? And they might actually get in the way of them operating and doing the call really well, because they're nervous, because it's outside of their reality. Okay, so these are the things that your kind of positive mindset won't actually fix. However, we want to get even deeper than that, just because the 20, the 50, whatever number it is, that's generated by the underlying map. That's not the underlying map itself. So for example, if I'm operating under an assumption that my underlying map might be like a feeling of not wanting to ask for too much, right? This is very common, the too much map. And this comes up often when I work with clients who want to put their price up, and they get the feeling of like, I can't, and the mind will come up with all these reasons, which will come up here, right? They'll come up in the mind, all the reasons why they can't, and they'll try and battle here and convince themselves why they can't or why they can. But the actual creation of this problem comes from the underlying map. So let's say when they were younger and they had a parent who was like, no, that's too much. And even if it's not verbally said out loud, if they could feel the parent's anxiety around them kind of asking for something or them wanting something, or they just saw the parent would kind of limit themselves, they might take on this assumption of too much. Even if it's not fully cognitive, it might be an emotional storyline, okay, or a somatic storyline. And so that's now influencing how they're operating in the world, where when they get to the point where they might ask at a new price point, they get really nervous, they become very anxious. The normal things they might do when it comes to objection handling just, escape their mind. They don't go for it, they don't push, because it goes against their identity, right? Now, the way we change our identity is not by going up, right? We don't push our identity up to 20, 50, whatever it is, the number. We just remove what's in the way of it. Because these numbers really don't have so much meaning, right? We create the meaning around them. For someone, 50K a month, even 100K a month, 200K a month, even millions, might just be a walk in the park. That's just like, okay, that's my everyday, that's my baseline, I feel very calm, very relaxed about. It's not even that I feel relaxed about, that's just like so normal, it doesn't even warrant an emotional response. And someone who's equally as skilled, equally as talented, has real capacity, could only feel that at maybe 20, right? Or 10 or 5, depending what it is. And so the money and the number doesn't matter, but the story that we have with it does. And so what we do is we find the story. Let's say in this situation, it was like the too much story, the feeling of, I can't ask that, I can't do that, that's too much. And then we notice that that's just projected onto a number, right? So someone could actually have this too much story, and it could operate when we get to 20K, it could operate when we get to 5K, and it could operate when we get to 100, right? So someone might actually just be really swimming along to like 90K, right? That's just their set point. This story doesn't get triggered for whatever reason, right? It just depends how the story is internalized, okay? But then the moment they reach 100K, or they're about to, this gets triggered. And now they experience plateau, okay? Because it wasn't about the number, right? What's the difference between them grinding to get to 50 to grinding to get to 90, and now but 100? That's like, ooh, that's too much, okay? And I see this all the time with people who get to like, let's say, almost 19, but not 20, right? So they're at the point where it's like, oh, 20K for them, that triggers something like this story. But the 19 doesn't trigger it, so they feel comfortable and safe there. So they naturally always get to that point. You might notice that in yourself. Now, what do we do here? Well, we just realize that the story is being generated internally, okay? Not by our mindset, not by positive thinking, not by any of this stuff, affirmations. It does not matter. This is irrelevant. That is just the product. That's the symptom and the trigger, right? That's like, if this is the seed, this is the branches and the leaves, and they're mostly irrelevant. We just work with the roots, the seeds. Okay, that's all we care about. So what we do is we wonder, what generated this to begin with? And let's say in the situation of the too much, I took that from a family member, right? And I took that kind of anxiety, that nervousness, the storyline, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to give it back to them. That's it. I'm going to give it back to them. And what happens when we give it back to them is that we just get to experience a life without that story, right? And it's a symbolic giving back. They don't actually take anything on. We're just getting rid of it for ourselves. So now we get just this empty space where the old belief used to be, right? And it's more than just a belief. It's the story, the symbols, the emotions, the somatic experience, right? So it's everything that we took on, we give back to the point where it just doesn't exist, okay? Now, in this stage, we don't fill anything in, we don't add a new belief, we just let our system operate from this new space, a space that never took on that question to begin with, that never even had the idea of something being too much. So what do you think happens here? Well, all of this stuff, these branches, these kind of seeds, these leaves, that came from the seed, that came from the root of the tree, right, that came from that underlying assumption, are given away. They drop away too, because they only live within a context that was created by the seed. So we get this really clean internal map now. And so now, let's say that person who the story was getting triggered when we get to 100K, now there's no difference for them going from to get to 90K to get to 100 or 200, whatever it may be. Because the story is empty, right? The story that was blocking them, the map that was getting in the way, is completely empty. And so they can just use the same capacity they had to get to that next stage, because there's no difference between that step and the step they just took, right? Step 1 and step 10. The only difference is that before, step 10 had this crazy story attached to it, but now it doesn't. Now step 10 is just emotionally neutral, right? And sometimes even it starts off emotionally neutral, and then we actually recover some of the things we might have lost from taking on that story, often joy, peace, a real sense of aliveness. But even if we don't include any of that, because that's really wonderful, but it's a little bit irrelevant to what we're speaking about. When we just give ourselves a clear runway towards our goal, which almost no one has, right? And that's usually the people who are at that goal, it's because they had the clear runway, right? Just there was nothing getting in the way internally that made it difficult for them to do that. And so this makes it just so much easier to get to whatever our goal might be, to get to break the ceiling, because we realize the ceiling never existed. The ceiling was only created by our mind, okay? And so what I'd invite you to do after exploring this is to just explore in your own internal world. Where have you created ceilings? Where have you created stories that are stopping you from just naturally going step 1, step 2, step 3 to 10, right? Or to whatever your goal might be. And to look internally, and to even look where you might have taken that from. Because when we know where we've taken it from, we can just give it back, and we can just live with the clarity and the peace as we walk towards our goal gently and easily, without friction.